All right, welcome. So today we're going to talk about a CNN article which came out, which is based on an interview with FTC Chair Lina Khan, who laid out a high-level agenda for her agency. However, what still remains unanswered for me is whether the proposed regulation will actually tackle the issues that they're raising in a way that addresses the problem, but without doing in sort of the traditional governmental regulatory way that inevitably fails and is just a lot of bureaucracy. So let's find out my thoughts on this and how I would approach it and what Lina Khan said her priorities are when we get back. Welcome to Assembly Unfiltered. I'm your host, Satchel, and co-founder of Assembly, the Learn to Earn platform. Assembly Unfiltered is a podcast about democracy, privacy, blockchain, politics, leadership, company culture, crypto, security, and startups. It's meant for anyone who believes that all of us are living in challenging, turbulent, and even exciting times. We're living in a moment ripe for dramatic change. We envision this as a podcast for our tribe, people who share an interest in how all these threads weave together for better communities. This is meant for our learners, voters, advertisers, civic organizations, tech geeks, developers, and employees. I hope you enjoy this episode of Assembly Unfiltered. All right, so this article came out from CNN, which is based on an interview which they had done. And a key phrase from the article was that in this interview, her remarks highlight how expansively the FTC views its mission. And then it says there are three priorities. So what were the three priorities according to this article? The first was revamping the DOJ's merger guidelines. The second was regulating anti-competitive practices such as non-compete clauses. And the third is tougher rules on corporate data collection policies. So in terms of number one and number two, I don't have a particularly strong opinion. I actually do think the way the DOJ evaluates mergers probably isn't necessarily a bad thing. I think there are things that are mergers which may just be concentrating power and, more importantly, limiting competition, which I think really is the key to all of this. Is regulation comes into play when it makes it more competitive. That is just better capitalism. So regulating anti-competitive practices such as non-compete clauses, also totally fair game. Really don't understand the role for most non-compete clauses when it comes to technology, except for very, very specialized cases. And then tougher rules on corporate data collection policies. So related to that, the article states that Congress may add on top of this legislation that establishes the country's first ever national data privacy rights. So all sounds good. And the third of corporate data collection, data privacy does fall squarely within my interest and the topics of this blog and podcast. And I think that feels like the right direction. That's what I'm going to focus for the rest of this. Now, I've talked a little bit about my feelings about regulation in the case of securities. And my thesis there is that we should lean more on transparency versus bureaucracy. And I still hold to that. And I think it can be applied to better data collection policies. Now, right now, we already see a number of legislation that's come out in Europe and the United States and the state of California, which is fining companies that are misappropriating and misusing data. So there are fines for breaches, there are fines for like revealing private information. And okay, that's all good and fine. Fines play a role. They are, or they can be, a deterrent. But for very large companies, a lot of jokes are made that even at $1 billion some dollars was one of their fines. It was a rounding error for them. And so not really a deterrent. So that's something to consider. A fine, however, even if proportionally less for a startup, is much more harmful. And so I think that's the lens I'm taking a look at, is we got to find a way for it's not to be bureaucracy, form filling, or weirdly, a lot of this GDPR and other kind of stuff. It's just a bunch of pop-ups, which to me is the same as bureaucracy. It's just a bunch of CYA content coming on a website saying you allow somebody to track you. But that doesn't seem to really solve the problem. I think the approach, similar to how I talked about with regulation, is just greater transparency in how data is collected and how it is used, and do so in a way that preserves privacy. To me, that's the direction that the regulation should take. It's good that they're solving the problem. It is a legitimate problem. But if it becomes more paperwork and form filling and putting up pop-ups and there's a fine, and the way to get to that fine is just a lot of like lawyers getting together and evaluating stuff. I mean, that is clearly the wrong direction to go. Anything that's going to require lawyers to come and battle on whether someone violated a policy is already a bad idea. You now got mixing some of the worst parts of society that affects companies, which is you're mixing government with lawyers, with bureaucracy, which is stuff that's not provable, a lot of paperwork, and it just becomes a huge mess. However, when we say regulation is stipulating better observability and saying we want to be able to inspect everything and anybody can do it, that sounds scary, but that's much better because it removes all the paperwork and it just puts it writ large. Anybody can go ahead and see it within reason. And obviously there's some nuances that we could get there, but it's not unheard of, and it's certainly possible. And I'm not going to go into the deep technical implementation. I think it's probably worth talking about it in more detail and with greater detail later. But right now, I just want to lay out the foundational idea. So the first one is the actual software. So I didn't come up with this. I mean, even Elon Musk, when talking about Twitter, has said, well, a lot of that software ought to be just open source so people can understand how the algorithms work. Boom. That is what it means to be observable. And I think that's really possible to do, and regulators with enough technical competence, which is another side, which many of them don't, but could say, look, we want to start seeing an increasing amount of your software being open sourced. Now, the response from many would be, well, that's our competitive mode, is all the IP and how we, track people and how we surface recommendations for ads. And it's kind of like, yeah, maybe, but not really, because their real competitive advantage is the fact that they have network effects, and they have multiple network effects. And so the actual algorithms up to a point really don't matter that much. Okay, there might be some cases where it's like, yeah, I don't think that they want to disclose it. But seriously, if a competitor had a way of surfacing videos, Facebook doesn't need to look at someone's open source software to figure out how they could do the same thing. They probably can reverse engineer it, and it's really not that big of a deal. Like, the underlying software at the stage that these companies are at isn't really the essence of their defenses. The essence of the defenses of the competitive moat is the fact that they have so much existing data, and they have so many existing users, and they have flywheels and network effects that keep people coming back to it. So I think that, making as much of it inspectable, the algorithms and the software is probably the direction. Now, I think it's possible to start drawing lines and doing it. So for example, okay, we don't want to see your algorithms for now. Let's say that's 5 years out, so you have time to do stuff. But what could be in scope is the actual data pipelines. What's the software that takes data from the point of ingestion, and they probably have multiple points of ingestion, to how they get to your training environment for your AI algorithms? I actually think that's not a bad place to start. Yes, it would be complicated, but I think when you start with the end, which is you want to have trust in how the data is used. Fortunately, since these companies have really designed it so that they didn't care, they figured no one's going to do it, and they are going to misuse the data, of course it's going to be hard. But that's what regulation needs to do. The reverse is they're just trying to penalize them for things that they can't see. That's sort of like trying to punish a child in class for misbehaving or cheating, but you can't actually look and see the child cheating. You have to kind of like ask them, hey, has any of you been cheating? And then kind of doing all kinds of wrangling about, well, I saw that person cheat, but no, that person is lying. Well, I think that person is trustworthy. And it just becomes, endlessly ugly. So I think looking at data sources and data pipelines seems to be a reasonable disclosure, because the mechanisms of how they move the data certainly cannot be argued to be competitive, because the end consumers within the system is the algorithms, and for now they could probably hide those. The second is to actually inspect the actual data that has been collected and do so in a way without violating privacy. And so I think there is really an interesting surface area of ways to solve it with different types of cryptography, including zero knowledge proofs. And all of those are pointing to the direction of being able to prove something about the data without disclosing the contents of the data. And so I think if we looked at it backwards and said, okay, what is it that we want to know about the data that anybody can inspect on an ongoing basis? Well, I would say if we're concerned about the kind of data that a system is using, then being able to inspect the very database where all the data resides and make that really open without disclosing data is probably a good, place to start. So let's imagine that the regulation was to require that all data that is being used for targeting of ads is first-person data, meaning it's provided by the person that the data is about. If I'm providing an address or I'm providing a party affiliation, I'm providing it. You're not getting it from a credit card company or a data broker which has sold it to you. So there needs to be proof that the first-party data was what provided it. And so one way to do that, and I don't want to get into the specifics of the how in detail. I'm just illustrating the what, because I think that's sort of the line where regulators can get to. They need to believe and certifiably prove there is a solution. It is viable. It is not asking for, pie in the sky, but do not specify the how, just the what. So, if a large database needs to be publicly accessible, reliable, but encrypted, blockchain in many ways is that very definition. It is built on principles of cryptography and is designed to be publicly accessible and immutable. So the question then becomes, well, is it possible to prove that the data is first-party data and without revealing the actual data? And I believe that is actually possible to do. And in fact, not only is it possible to do, but the analytic service or the verifying service that's constantly perhaps running could also itself be open source. So anybody can actually not only see the results, so think of it as a canary, it's like a report that just shows here's the amount of data and number of records that were not provided by a first party. And it's just a dashboard that displays it. And hopefully that number is always zero. But the service that provides that could be and should be open source, so anybody can look at it and say, yeah, this thing isn't cheating. It's actually open source software that genuinely is looking at it in certain ways. And if it's truly open source, then perhaps other people can contribute and add more data to ensure the integrity of the underlying data. Now, a second related regulation could be that, well, you know what? This is related to all the stuff that's going on with Twitter, is that regulation and so forth, and the regulations require that all users of the systems be verified against some KYC, Know Your Customer standard, without revealing any PII. So in other words, making sure that the people in that database, without revealing any information about the person, is actually a real person. And I think that's actually also possibly possible. One way would be a set of verifiable identity providers. So there are a bunch of startups and maybe larger companies that can do this, and just saying, look, you will provide a way for us to prove through some kind of a hash that the data that's been generated or associated with a person is in fact been proven to be verified. But you don't know anything about that person. So it's like, imagine it's a code that says this is a unique person. This is associated with this person, and it was generally generated by us. And therefore, we know it's a trusted identity. And so imagine if you're able to like say, okay, I want to scan the database. I want to see, is there more than one of these in here? Or is there any one of these that isn't verifiable as a hash? You see how that's simple to be able to say, okay, well, I just want to see how many people really have been verified. And hopefully that is 100% and not 0. And then the second one is, well, of that data, can we now have a signature for all the data that's been doing? That's a cryptographic signature that shows that the data that was provided was in fact provided by a client associated with that verified identity. So once you find a way to sign all your data, somebody can check that signature and associate that with a verified identity. Now you have the structure or the makings of a way to actually verify those two things. Hey, is everybody in the system actually a verified person, not a bot, not a duplicate? And the second one is I want to verify that it's by a first-party data. This data came from with the consent by a verified person. So I think we can keep the requirements quite simple. It is worth having a little more sort of discussion and a reference architecture perhaps to show how to do it, but without imposing a how as part of the regulation, which is always a bad idea. But notice how this doesn't rely on self-attestation by a closed, centralized entity. I mean, that approach will always be untrustworthy and fraught with all kinds of issues. So the question could be, well, would this regulation require a huge lift by legacy companies, which did not build on an open system, which did not have identity verification in mind, did not think about cryptographically first principles? And yes, it may be, but that shouldn't be a reason not to regulate it. Like, if it's hard and the regulations in its principle and its intent are legitimate and valid and not pie in the sky, if the company that needs to meet those regulations does have a large lift, it means they're just way out of scope of those regulations. And perhaps the regulation came too late, which is probably the case with the privacy and data inspection and the data collection bit. So, on the other hand, it is a way to pay the pathway forward that's supportive of startups and smaller companies. So you can imagine if the regulation came in, a bunch of startups could come in, that it makes it easier for large scale enterprises that are legacy based to do so more easily. Or it could be, as I believe, it allows a whole range of startups to meet those principles, to meet the needs that are better for society and build it from the ground up and actually have a chance at competing. And that competition actually will make these legacy organizations better while providing alternative solutions. So this is my thought about, regulation and really thinking through. A lot of regulators seem to be good about what is wrong and this is what it should look like. And boy, but this is wrong, and nating the problem. And that's the nature of regulation. That's the nature of law. It's like, okay, this is a problem, stop it. But the problems is that mindset is all paper-based, litigation-based, regulation-based, and they're all just going to come, and it really just creates more money and more work for lawyers. That's unfortunately the way it goes around. I'm trying to say regulation actually can be good, but let's make it smart. Let's make it based on technology, engineering, open principles, and like good cryptography. This is a whole new world that's evolving right now that really can make things so much simpler. And we don't have to have regulation by bureaucracy, but regulation by transparency. But let me know what you think. And there's plenty of ways to get involved. Just look in the show notes, and looking forward to your comments or questions and getting involved. And if you're on the podcast, just note that there is a way you can actually record your question. And if it's, it's good, I'll include it in the next podcast. So until next time, thanks again. This is Assembly Unfiltered.